The inbred Habsburg emperor born with water on his brain. The Habsburgs believed in blood. Not in the way poets or patriots speak of it, but in a literal, genetic sense. Blood was power, a sacred essence to be kept pure, guarded within the family like a secret too dangerous to share. Across generations, they married uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins, weaving a tapestry of lineage so tightly bound that it eventually began to strangle itself. And in 1661, on a November day in Madrid, the cost of that obsession was delivered into the world in the form of a baby boy, the long-awaited heir to the Spanish throne. They named him Charles, and from his first breath, he was both a king and a walking tragedy. Even the initial reports from the court were contradictory, as if no one wanted to admit what they were seeing. Some dispatches, perhaps driven by propaganda or desperate hope, described a robust infant with beautiful features and a healthy appetite. But the French ambassador, a man with no reason to lie, sent a colder, more honest assessment to Paris. The prince, he wrote, seemed extremely weak. He showed clear signs of degeneration. His cheeks were covered in phlegmons, his head was crusted with scabs, and his neck oozed with some kind of suppuration. This was not the usual frailty of a newborn. This was something deeply, structurally wrong. Charles's family tree was a sickbed. His father was Philip IV of Spain. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was also his father's niece. This made Charles not just a son but a genetic knot, a point where the family line folded back upon itself so severely that his inbreeding coefficient surpassed that of a child born from a brother and sister. This was no accident of history but the logical endpoint of a marital strategy so restrictive that of 11 royal marriages over 2 centuries, nearly all involved some degree of consanguinity. And now, the consequences were made flesh. The child they called the Bewitched grew slowly, painfully, against the grain of normal life. While other royal children were learning to ride horses or study Latin, Charles was struggling to exist inside his own body. He did not speak until he was 4 years old. He did not walk until he was 8, or perhaps even 10, his legs too weak and twisted by rickets to support him, requiring leg braces just to stand. The most striking feature was his face, dominated by the infamous Habsburg jaw, an extreme mandibular prognathism so severe that his teeth did not meet, making it nearly impossible to chew food properly. He swallowed his meals largely whole, a habit that would torment his digestion for the rest of his life. His tongue was said to be so large that his speech, when it finally came, was barely intelligible, a thick mumble that isolated him within his own court. And then there was his head. It was disproportionately large for his body, or perhaps in certain respects too small in relation to his frame. This was the external sign of a far deeper crisis. Inside his skull, the delicate balance of fluid that cushions the brain had gone terribly wrong. Charles II, the king of an empire, was suffering from hydrocephalus, water on the brain. The autopsy report, written after his death decades later, would shock even the physicians accustomed to the brutality of 17th-century medicine. It described a body that seemed already dead long before the heart stopped. His corpse contained barely a drop of blood. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn, a withered, useless thing. His lungs were corroded, his intestines putrefied and gangrenous, and he had only a single testicle, black as coal. But the most haunting detail, the one that seems to explain so much of his suffering, was the observation that his head was completely full of water. The ventricles of his brain, swollen with cerebrospinal fluid, had been crowding out the very tissue of thought and life for 38 years. Modern researchers, peering back through the centuries with clinical eyes, have debated the root of this hydrocephalus. Some suggest it was a consequence of the relentless inbreeding, tied to genetic disorders like distal renal tubular acidosis or Fragile X syndrome, conditions that manifest with skeletal deformities and intellectual disability. But another theory gives the tragedy a different sort of origin. Charles, already so fragile, suffered a severe hepatic infection shortly after birth. Such infections, particularly in newborns, can inflame the brain's drainage systems, blocking the flow of fluid and causing hydrocephalus as a secondary effect. It is a cruel possibility that the genetic weakness of his bloodline left him vulnerable, and a common virus struck the final blow. To the people of Spain, such medical explanations were beside the point. What they saw was a king whose body and mind seemed touched by something supernatural. His epileptic fits, his vomiting, his periods of vacant depression followed by manic energy, all of it fed the belief that he was not merely ill but el hechizado, the bewitched. Exorcists were brought to court. Rituals were performed. They tried to find the demons that had supposedly taken residence in his failing frame. The irony is bitter. The true curse was not cast by a witch but by a marriage policy. His life was a series of painful negations. He could not govern effectively. He could not chew his food. He could barely walk, though he did surprise contemporaries with his love of hunting, a singular passion where perhaps the weight of the crown lifted and he could simply move, aim, and exist in the open air. But the most politically devastating of his failures was also the most personal. He could not produce an heir. He married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans and then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but both unions remained barren. The whispers grew louder. The king was impotent, unable to fulfill the primary duty of his station. The infertility was yet another piece of the genetic puzzle. Today, some researchers propose he had Klinefelter syndrome, an XXY chromosomal disorder that causes small testicles and sterility, combined perhaps with Fragile X syndrome causing intellectual impairment. Others point to combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his short stature, impotence, and weak muscles. Whatever the precise molecular error, the result was the same. The lineage that had clutched the Spanish throne so tightly was about to slip from its grasp forever. Charles spent his final years as a phantom in a palace, his body swelling with edema, what they then called dropsy. His heart failure grew so severe that his legs, belly, and face bloated with retained fluid. He was a man who looked 80 at 38, a crumpled, suffering figure shuffling through the endless corridors of the Alcázar, staring at paintings of ancestors whose marriages had sealed his fate. He was surrounded by the whispers of ambassadors and the scheming of relatives, all waiting for him to die, waiting to carve up the empire that stretched from the Americas to the Philippines. As one historian grimly noted, from the day of his birth, the world had been waiting for his death. When the end finally came on the 1st of November in 1700, it was almost a relief, a quiet extinguishing of a broken body. He was 38 years old. He had reigned for 35 of those years, though he rarely truly ruled. His death did not just end a life, it broke a dynasty. The Spanish Habsburgs, who had dominated Europe for nearly 2 centuries through strategic marriages and sheer dynastic luck, were gone, extinguished by the very strategy that had defined them. In his will, he named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor. But the idea of France and Spain uniting under one family terrified the rest of Europe. The peace shattered. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, a bloody, continent-wide conflict that redrew the map of Europe and ended Spanish hegemony for good. The obsession with keeping the bloodline pure had led not to strength but to a catastrophic war that bled the nations dry. Charles II, the boy born with water on his brain, the man who could not speak clearly or eat easily, left a legacy more profound than many conquering heroes. He is a historical lesson written in flesh and bone, a testament to the fragility of the human body and the catastrophic arrogance of dynastic ambition. When the physicians opened his skull and found it filled with water, they were looking at more than a pathology. They were looking at the flooded ruins of an entire family's delusion, the final, silent scream of a genetic line that had turned inward and drowned itself. The political earthquake triggered by Charles's death did not wait for his body to grow cold. While the physicians were still recording the grim details of his autopsy, the peppercorn heart, the single blackened testicle, the skull brimming with water, the ambassadors of Europe were already opening their sealed instructions. The continent had been holding its breath for decades, and now the exhale came as a violent storm. To understand the magnitude of what ended in that bedchamber on November 1, 1700, one must step back and see the empire that Charles had nominally ruled. This was not merely Spain. This was a global colossus, a patchwork of territories stitched together by conquest, inheritance, and Catholic ambition. The Spanish crown held Naples, Sicily, and the strategic Duchy of Milan in Italy. It controlled the Spanish Netherlands, roughly modern Belgium, a rich and perpetually contested buffer zone against the Dutch and French. And beyond Europe, it claimed a vast American empire stretching from Mexico to Peru, the silver mines of Potosi, the treasure fleets, the Philippines, and islands scattered across the Caribbean. To be king of Spain was to hold the keys to unimaginable wealth and strategic dominance. The question of who would inherit this sprawling inheritance was the great diplomatic puzzle of the age, and Charles, simply by being unable to produce a child, had turned the puzzle into a powder keg. The two main claimants were bound to Charles by blood that was itself a map of Habsburg and Bourbon entanglements. On one side stood the French House of Bourbon. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had married Charles's half-sister, Maria Theresa. This made his grandson, Philip of Anjou, a great-nephew to the dying Spanish king. It was Philip's name that Charles, after agonizing consultation and under immense pressure, had written into his final will. But the French claim terrified the rest of Europe. A Bourbon on the Spanish throne raised the specter of a unified Franco-Spanish superstate, a single dynasty controlling the wealth of the Indies, the Mediterranean gateways, and a land border that hemmed in the Dutch Republic. For England and the Dutch, this was an existential threat. On the other side stood the Austrian Habsburgs, the family from which Charles himself had sprung. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I was Charles's first cousin, the son of another Mariana of Austria, the Spanish king's aunt. Leopold's younger son, Archduke Charles, was put forward as the legitimate Austrian candidate. He could claim the same bloodline, the same dynastic right, and he offered a continuation of the Habsburg presence on the Spanish throne, albeit under the Austrian branch. For the maritime powers, a Habsburg restoration in Spain, separating the crowns again, seemed the safer option, a way to check French ambition without placing the entire Spanish inheritance under a single, overpowering monarch. Charles II, in his final tormented years, had been a puppet pulled by both strings. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was staunchly pro-Austrian, her family tied to the imperial court in Vienna. She filled his chambers with talk of Habsburg loyalty and Bourbon deceit. But the pro-French faction at court, led by men who saw the rising power of Louis XIV as an unstoppable tide, urged the king toward pragmatism. Cardinal Portocarrera, a wily and powerful churchman, argued that only France had the military strength to preserve the Spanish Empire intact. A Habsburg candidate, he warned, would mean partition, the empire carved into pieces by its enemies before the body was even buried. Charles, racked with fever and the constant hum of cranial pressure, his mind clouded by fluid and failing neurons, sought divine guidance. He consulted theologians. He prayed before relics. He even, in a macabre nod to family tradition, ordered the exhumation of his ancestors, as if the dead could offer counsel that the living withheld. Finally, his pen moved. He signed the will bequeathing everything to Philip of Anjou, with the single critical caveat that the crowns of France and Spain must never be united in one person. When the news reached Versailles, Louis XIV faced a choice that would define his reign. He could accept the will, placing his grandson on the Spanish throne and honoring the clause of separation. Or he could reject it and adhere to a prior partition treaty he had signed with England and the Dutch, which would carve up the Spanish Empire but avert a general war. Ambition, family pride, and the sheer strategic temptation won. Philip of Anjou became Philip V of Spain. The famous, perhaps apocryphal, words attributed to Louis, "There are no longer any Pyrenees," captured the essence of the fear that now gripped Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession that followed was not a single, clean conflict but a sprawling, decade-long hemorrhage that spanned the globe. It was a war of grand alliances, shifting loyalties, and a new kind of total mobilization. The Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy led the Allied forces against the French marshals in battles whose names still echo with the sound of massed musketry and cavalry charges: Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet. Each was a slaughter, each a testament to the industrial scale of early modern warfare. In Spain itself, the war became a bitter civil conflict, with Castile largely supporting the Bourbon Philip and the eastern regions of Aragon and Catalonia rising for the Habsburg Archduke Charles. It was a war of sieges and atrocities, of English sailors capturing Gibraltar and of partisans waging guerrilla combat in the Spanish hills. Through all this thunder and blood, the physical legacy of Charles II lingered like a ghost. The man who could not sire an heir had set the stage for the first great global conflict of the modern age. His deformed body, the product of a genetic collapse, became the fulcrum upon which the fate of empires turned. The doctors who had puzzled over his hydrocephalus, his rickets, his single testicle, could never have imagined that their clinical notes would one day be read as a political document, an explanation for a world war. But they are. The water on his brain, pressing against the tissue of thought, helped drown a continent in fire. Beyond the grand strategy and the dynastic chess game, there is a more intimate, more haunting dimension to Charles' story. It lies in the question of consciousness. What was it like to be Charles II, the bewitched? He was not a fool in the sense of being completely insensate. He was aware of his inadequacy. He knew the whispers. He felt the immense, crushing weight of expectation pressing down on a frame too weak to bear it. He lived in one of the most formal, rigidly ceremonial courts in Europe, where the king was a semi-divine figure, the center of an elaborate ritual universe. And he, this stammering, unsteady, hydrocephalic man, was expected to be the unmoving sun around which all this grandeur orbited. The psychological torment must have been profound, a daily performance of inadequacy before an audience of courtiers who were already calculating his death. His religious fervor, often cited as evidence of a simple mind, might be reinterpreted as a desperate search for meaning in a life that seemed cosmically cursed. If his body was a prison of malformed bone and pressurized fluid, then perhaps his soul could be pure. He surrounded himself with relics and images of suffering. The exorcisms, which to modern sensibilities seem medieval and cruel, might have offered him a narrative that was easier to bear than the cold truth of genetics. It was better to believe he was bewitched, the victim of a malevolent external force, than to accept that he was the inevitable, rotten fruit of his family's tree. A demon could be cast out. The Habsburg jaw, the fragile X chromosome, the renal acidosis that hardened his bones wrong, these could not. And then there is the matter of his marriages, those profoundly sad, sterile unions. Marie-Louise of Orleans, his first wife, was a young French princess sent to this strange, somber court. She was lively, beautiful, and utterly unprepared for the reality of her husband. Letters and dispatches paint a picture of her profound unhappiness, her horror at his physical condition, her desperate attempts to conceive an heir that would secure her position. Rumors swirled that Charles was impotent, that the marriage was never consummated, that the pressure to perform only deepened his physical and psychological paralysis. Marie-Louise died young, at 26, of a sudden illness that many believed was poison, a suspicion that dogged the Spanish court like a shadow. Her death left Charles desolate and guilty. He was forced to marry again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess who was, by all accounts, stronger-willed and more overtly political. But the result was the same. no child, no hope, just the endless, humiliating cycle of prayers, potions, and public scrutiny. His sterility was not a private sorrow, it was the central political crisis of the realm, discussed in every chancellery in Europe, a failure that ended his every waking moment. The autopsy itself, that final, clinical indignity, was performed by the royal physicians with the grim curiosity of men who had spent decades watching their patient decay. The report they produced reads less like a medical document and more like a Gothic horror. The heart was the size of a peppercorn, the lungs were corroded, the intestines putrefied and gangrenous, in the brain only water. The language is stark, almost accusatory. They were not just describing a corpse, they were cataloguing the total failure of a biological system. The phrase "no blood in his body" is particularly chilling. It suggests a kind of pre-mortem death, a desiccation, as if his lineage had literally drained the life force out of him. For centuries, that autopsy report was the definitive, gruesome portrait of the man. But modern medical historians, armed with retrodiagnosis, have picked apart its metaphors. The absence of blood likely reflected post-mortem clotting and the language of humoral medicine, not literal exsanguination. The peppercorn heart might describe atrophy from chronic disease, not congenital minuteness. The water on the brain, however, remains the most convincing and central finding, a condition that would explain his physical and intellectual impairments, his seizures, his mood swings, and his eventual decline. The debate continues among geneticists and historians. Was it a combination of two recessive disorders meeting in one tragic body? The inbreeding coefficient calculated by some researchers to be 0.254 meant that Charles was more inbred than the offspring of a sibling union. This astonishing level of homozygosity made it a statistical near-certainty that he would express recessive diseases that a more genetically diverse individual would have safely carried in silence. The theory of combined pituitary hormone deficiency explains much: the short stature, the lack of sexual development, the muscle weakness, the infertility. The theory of Fragile X syndrome explains the intellectual disability and the prominent, elongated facial features that stretched beyond even the infamous Habsburg jaw. The theory of distal renal tubular acidosis explains the rickets, the weakened bones, and the large head due to a form of metabolic bone disease. It is possible, even likely, that all of these were present, a perfect storm of genetic pathologies converging on a single human being who was forced to wear a crown. Charles II of Spain is more than a historical curiosity, more than a cautionary tale about the perils of royal inbreeding. He is a figure of profound pathos, a man whose suffering was written into his DNA before he drew his first breath. He was born into a world that demanded everything of him: strength, wisdom, virility, authority, and his body gave him nothing. He could not rule, could not love, could not father, could not even eat without struggle. And yet, this powerless man, through his very lack of power, reshaped the world. His death was the detonator for a war that killed hundreds of thousands, redrew the map of Europe, and marked the rise of England as a global power and the beginning of the end for Spanish hegemony. His legacy is not in monuments or conquests but in silence. It is in the empty alcoves of the Escorial, in the genes that stopped, in the watery void inside his skull where thought should have been. Charles the Bewitched is history's most literal illustration of a dynasty drowning in itself. The water on his brain was not just a medical condition, it was the accumulated pressure of a family that had turned inward so completely that it collapsed into a singularity of suffering, taking a continent with it into the darkness. The war did not end quickly. What began in 1701 ground on for over a decade, a continent-wide conflagration that consumed lives and treasure on a scale that dwarfed anything Europe had seen since the religious wars of the previous century. The diplomats who had schemed in the candlelit chambers of Versailles, Vienna, and London had unleashed forces they could not easily control. And at the center of it all, like a silent, decomposing keystone, lay the memory of Charles II, the man whose broken body had made it all inevitable. The fighting in Spain itself took on a particularly bitter character. This was not merely a foreign invasion but a civil war, a fracture that split the Spanish people along deep regional lines. Castile, the heartland of the monarchy, largely rallied to Philip V, the Bourbon claimant. He was the king named in the will, the king anointed by the dying breath of the last Habsburg. To the Castilian nobility and peasantry, loyalty to Philip was loyalty to the legitimate order, to the sanctity of inheritance, to the ghost of Charles himself. But in the eastern kingdoms of Aragon, and especially in Catalonia, the calculus was different. These regions had long guarded their ancient privileges, their fueros, against the centralizing tendencies of the Spanish crown. They looked at the Bourbon model of absolutism, the Sun King's relentless crushing of provincial autonomy, and they recoiled. Better, they thought, to throw their lot in with the Austrian Habsburgs, who promised to respect their traditional liberties. Archduke Charles landed in Barcelona, set up his court, and for years eastern Spain became a Habsburg redoubt, a rival kingdom within the peninsula. The war in Spain was savage, a grinding affair of sieges, raids, and scorched earth campaigns. The Allies took Gibraltar in 1704, a momentous event that seemed minor at the time but would resonate through centuries. The English fleet, growing in confidence and power, dominated the Mediterranean littoral. The Duke of Berwick, an illegitimate son of James II fighting for the French, moved through the Spanish interior with brutal efficiency. Towns changed hands repeatedly. Harvests were burned. Civilians were massacred. The war was not an abstract Game of Thrones, it was a lived nightmare for the peasants who watched foreign soldiers trample their fields and desecrate their churches. All of this, every musket shot and every burned village, traced its lineage back to the water in Charles's brain. The infertility of one man had become the mortality of thousands. As the years dragged on, the strategic situation shifted in ways that would have seemed unthinkable at the outset. The great alliance that opposed Louis XIV began to fray. The Duke of Marlborough, the brilliant English general who had humbled the French at Blenheim and Ramillies, fell from political favor in London. His wife's influence over Queen Anne waned, and the Whig war party was replaced by Tories eager for peace. The war was expensive, terribly expensive, and the English public was growing weary of continental entanglements that seemed to benefit Dutch merchants and German princes more than Englishmen. But the truly decisive event occurred in Vienna. In 1711, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I died without a male heir. His brother, the very same Archduke Charles who was fighting to become King of Spain, was suddenly elevated to the imperial throne. The man the Allies had been fighting to place on the Spanish throne was now the Holy Roman Emperor. The specter that had justified the war in the first place, the fear of a single dynasty dominating Europe, had flipped. If Charles won now, the Habsburgs would reunite the empire of Charles V, a prospect just as terrifying to the maritime powers as a Bourbon superstate. The whole rationale for the war evaporated. The peace that followed was stitched together through a series of treaties at Utrecht, Rastatt, and Baden. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 was the centerpiece, a diplomatic revolution that established a new order in Europe. Philip V was recognized as the legitimate king of Spain, the Bourbon dynasty installed on the throne that Charles II had vacated. But the clause of separation that Charles had insisted upon in his will was now enforced by international law. Philip renounced any claim to the French throne and the French princes renounced any claim to the Spanish. The crowns would remain forever apart. The Spanish Empire, however, was dismembered. Austria received the Italian territories, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia, along with the Spanish Netherlands. Britain, the rising power, took Gibraltar and Minorca, strategic footholds in the Mediterranean that it retains, in the case of Gibraltar, to this very day. Britain also secured the asiento, the lucrative contract to supply enslaved Africans to the Spanish-American colonies, a grim prize that reflected the brutal economic realities underpinning the war. Spain, the global hegemon of the 16th century, emerged from the war diminished, a second-rank power, its European empire reduced to a core around the peninsula itself, though its American possessions remained vast. This was the political legacy of Charles II, ironic gift of the bewitched. A man who could not produce an heir had, through his death, remade the map of the world. The balance of power, that concept so dear to the Enlightenment diplomats who followed, was carved out of the void he left behind. Britain's rise to maritime and imperial preeminence, which would define the next 2 centuries, was accelerated dramatically by the War of the Spanish Succession. The Dutch Republic, bled white by the conflict, began its long decline from the pinnacle of its golden age. France, though victorious in placing a Bourbon on the Spanish throne, was financially exhausted, its population depleted, the Sun King's grand ambitions humbled by a decade of brutal warfare. And Austria, now the possessor of a Central European and Italian empire, turned its attention eastward, toward the Balkans and the looming threat of the Ottoman Turks. But there is a deeper, more philosophical legacy that Charles left behind, a legacy that unfolded not in treaty clauses and territorial adjustments but in the way humanity came to understand itself. The Spanish Habsburgs were the most public, most extreme case study in the dangers of consanguinity that history had ever provided. Their chins, their lips, their sickly children, their staggering infant mortality rate, and finally their terminal king, all of it was there, painted by Velázquez and other court artists, documented in diplomatic dispatches, dissected in autopsy reports. The decline of the Spanish Habsburgs was, in a very real sense, the first widely observed genetic experiment in human history, conducted not in a laboratory but on a throne. When Charles II died and his autopsy was circulated among the learned circles of Europe, it sparked a quiet but profound shift in medical and philosophical thought. The idea that the body, and even the mind, could be shaped so completely by the invisible hand of heredity was still in its infancy. The prevailing wisdom had long emphasized environment, humors, divine will, or the influence of the stars. But here was a dynasty that had married its own for 2 centuries and, at the end of it, produced a king whose body was a catalogue of failure. The pattern was undeniable. The physicians of the 18th century, standing on the cusp of the Enlightenment, began to look at the Habsburgs not as victims of witchcraft or divine punishment but as a biological phenomenon. The term Habsburg jaw entered the medical lexicon not as a dynastic curiosity but as a clinical sign, a visible marker of inbreeding depression. Charles II, the man who was barely a man, became an unwitting pioneer in the study of genetics, a discipline that would not formally exist for another 2 centuries. This medical legacy continues to resonate. In the 21st century, researchers equipped with genomic analysis have revisited the Spanish Habsburgs with a rigor that would have astonished the court physicians. Studies have calculated the inbreeding coefficient with mathematical precision, mapping the genealogical loops and double loops that led to Charles. They have proposed differential diagnoses using the full armamentarium of modern medicine, debating the relative contributions of renal tubular acidosis, Fragile X syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, and combined pituitary hormone deficiency. The water on his brain, which so horrified the 17th century doctors, is now understood as a symptom, not the disease itself, a manifestation of a systemic breakdown that was written into his very chromosomes. Charles has become a case study, a patient whose symptoms are analyzed in medical journals, his portraits examined for clinical signs of endocrine and genetic disorders. The boy who was believed to be bewitched is now a figure in textbooks on medical genetics, his suffering translated into the cold, precise language of DNA and inheritance. And yet, for all the clinical detachment that the passage of centuries allows, the human reality of Charles II remains profoundly moving. He was not a cipher or a case study. He was a man who lived, however constrained that living might have been. He experienced moments of happiness, perhaps on the hunting field where his physical limitations mattered less, the wind on his face, the thrill of the chase providing a fleeting liberation from the prison of his body. He experienced love, or something like it, in his attachments to his wives, however fraught those relationships were with political pressure and sexual humiliation. He experienced despair, the crushing weight of knowing that he was the end, that the dynasty which had produced saints and emperors, Charles V and Philip II, the dynasty that had ruled half the world, would die with him. He spent hours in prayer, prostrate before relics and crucifixes, seeking a solace that his counselors and physicians could not provide. His faith, often described as excessive, was perhaps the only outlet for a mind trapped in a failing body, a way to transcend the flesh that had betrayed him so completely. There is a portrait of Charles II, painted by Juan Carreño de Miranda, that captures something of this tragedy. He stands in the Hall of Mirrors in the Alcázar, a room of immense grandeur, his small, pale figure dwarfed by the vastness of the space. His face is elongated, his jaw protruding, his eyes wide and slightly unfocused. He is dressed in the most magnificent clothing, velvet and lace and gold, but the finery only accentuates the frailty of the man inside it. He looks like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes, a ghost haunting the palace that his ancestors built. It is a painting of immense pathos, whether intended or not. The artist could not hide the truth. The Habsburg jaw, the vacant stare, the awkward posture, they are all there, recorded for posterity. The picture is worth 1,000 medical reports. The Alcázar itself, the palace where Charles spent his entire life, no longer exists. It burned down on Christmas Eve in 1734, a spectacular fire that consumed centuries of art and history. The site is now occupied by the Royal Palace of Madrid, a grand Bourbon structure that symbolizes the new dynasty, the new order. The physical world of Charles II was erased, replaced, built over. But the memory of him, the bewitched, lingers in the cultural imagination. He appears in novels, in historical studies, in the whispered tales of tourists wandering through the halls of the Prado, where his portraits still hang. He is the ultimate cautionary figure, the embodiment of aristocratic decadence, the proof that blue blood, kept too pure, becomes a poison. And so we return to the water. The water on his brain, the fluid that filled his skull and compressed his mind, is the central metaphor for his entire existence. Water is life, but water in excess is death by drowning. The Habsburgs, in their obsession with purity, had created a genetic pool so shallow and stagnant that it could no longer sustain life. They drowned in themselves. Charles II was not just a victim of this process, he was its living embodiment, his every breath a testament to the catastrophe of inbreeding. When the physicians opened his skull and found only water, they were looking at the final, literal manifestation of a dynasty's self-destruction. The blood that had been so jealously guarded, the lineage that had been kept so carefully within the family, had finally, after 2 centuries of relentless contraction, dissolved into nothingness. Charles the Bewitched died as he had lived. A contradiction, a king who was barely a man, a ruler who could not rule, a husband who could not father, a Habsburg who could not continue. He was buried in the Pantheon of Kings at El Escorial, the great monastery palace built by his ancestor Philip II, a place of immense, cold grandeur. His sarcophagus sits among those of his ancestors, the long line of Charleses and Philips who had built the Spanish Empire. And yet, he is utterly alone there, the last of his kind, the period at the end of a very long and very tragic sentence. His epitaph is not carved in marble but in the understanding that some obsessions, pursued with sufficient arrogance and rigor, will inevitably destroy the very thing they seek to preserve. The Habsburgs wanted to keep their blood pure. They succeeded so well that, in the end, it was only water.